So very welcome, Philip, this evening. I'm very grateful that you accepted the invitation to come and speak for this series of talks. I first saw your name in a book called Spaces for the Sacred, which is here, and the fact that you speak about contested places long before I ever heard anyone else speak about that, but that may be me rather than anyone else. You grew up, I think, on the south coast with a contested place with various invasions of Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Romans, and others. And you point to that within Christianity itself, there's a contested place between the house of God and the house of the people of God. And a lot of what I read is within Christian tradition, there is a sort of dialectic between the universal and the particular that seems to have informed your understanding here, with that and that historical perspective of contested space. So you've had a long, illustrious career teaching at the University of London, I think Heathrow, 84 to 94, Cambridge, 92 to 97, Durham, and you're currently, if I get this right, at the Von Hugel Institute at St Edmund's College, Cambridge.
That's right.
Oh, good. And you've written about cities as well.
I have.
And so thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us, and I look forward to what you have to say. May I hand over to Eric?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so yeah, we're delighted that you can give this talk. Just to put in context that you know there are a number of strands of interest that I've found resonant, not least that early period of interest in India, and then through to a point where we met when the project of renovation, the restoration of St Martin in the Fields was nearing completion at a day's conference there on sacred space back in 2008. So it's now, that, as we were saying, quite a gap between then and now.
Yes.
Much water, and just really looking forward to picking up the conversation and hearing where your thoughts are. So thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I will move ahead immediately so that I won't use up a lot of time with anything else. The title of the talk I'm giving is The Beauty of Place. And I want to suggest in the talk that a sense of place is a highly important aspect of our human experience, which impacts strongly on how we engage with and relate to our surrounding world. A sense of place also reinforces our sense of identity, which is both personal and social. Now, first of all, I'm going to outline how I understand the notion of place. This is more than a mere division of physical space or a geographical location. And then second, I want to explain what I mean by beauty, particularly how historically in both philosophy and Christian theology, it implies more than simply being attractive or eye-catching. Understood in its deepest sense, the concept of beauty also embraces a sense of moral and spiritual values. And finally, I want to explore a significant example of how the positioning and design of certain buildings has historically helped to shape the human experience of place, and has also connected people to a deeper sense of beauty. And my chosen example is the role of sacred spaces in shaping place, particularly in historic European cities. And specifically, I'll look at the role of church buildings, particularly the great cathedrals, in the public square, and how we should interpret their positioning, their design, and their architecture. So first of all, our sense of place. The sense of place for me is one of the categories of human experience with the greatest impact on how we understand the world and situate ourselves within it. Whether consciously or not, we all have a world view in terms of which we live and identify ourselves. So the world that surrounds us, including the urban environment is not simply raw data, but something that evokes meaning for us. Place is more than a mere division of physical space or a social construction of secondary importance. In terms of wider human perceptions, the world doesn't exist as a straightforward given. It's experienced differently by different people, depending on perspective. Now, philosophers known as phenomenologists, such as Martin Heidegger, for example, therefore re-embrace the conviction that place, the specific, the tangible, the relational, precedes any general perception of the world. We come to know reality in terms of our experience of specific places. So, as I say, what does place mean? It's a location with particular significance because of its connection with the people who live there rather than somewhere else, or because it evokes something of significance. For example, the historical memories of a long-standing urban community. Place involves a dialectical relationship between physical environment, including the built environment, and human narratives. A sense of place is also bound up with moral and social values. So, for example, to know your place implies a sense of identity in relation to a wider social framework of people. To be in the right place is to feel at home. To be out of place signifies the opposite. Back in 2008, I was part of a seminar for architects sponsored by the Prince's Foundation on the theme of spiritual placemaking. This explored the spiritual as a vision of the deeper meaning of human existence. And the seminar raised the question of how architectural design could be more than purely functional and should aim to enhance the human spirit as well as protect the overall spirit of a place. The famous biblical scholar and religious thinker called Walter Brueggemann underscores the importance of spatial connections in our human lives. He says here we profoundly engage with the meaning of existence. Importantly for Brueggemann, a sense of place also embodies social and moral commitments. And I quote briefly, "Place is space which has historical meanings, where some things have happened which are now remembered and which provide continuity and identity across generations. Place is a declaration that our humanness can't be found in escape, detachment, absence of commitment, and undefined freedom." So place thus has a great deal to do with our commitment to human contexts. This suggests that a theological narrative of place needs to begin with serious attention to the value and importance of the particular contexts, including our built environment, particular people, and particular narratives. For me, the problem with a lot of Western thinking over the last couple of hundred years or so is that it's somewhat abstract and tends to stress the objective rather than the particular, the universal and disengaged rather than the personal. The connection between these emphases and a somewhat abstract and detached approach to religious thinking or theology is clear. However, the Christian story of the Incarnation affirms that God's commitment to humankind is expressed through entering human history in a particular person, Jesus of Nazareth, at a particular moment in time and in a particular place. However, while the narrative of Christianity's origins affirms history and place, both particular, there's always been a siren voice suggesting that what is really important exists on a dimension that is elsewhere, beyond space and time. In seeking a theological language that enables us to engage with the particular, including physical place, it's instructive to look at, for me, one of the great figures of medieval philosophy and theology, the Scotsman, John Duns Scotus. He flourished towards the end of the 13th century and taught both at Oxford and in Paris. It's widely agreed that the important key to Scotus is his concept of particularity, at the heart of which is a rich understanding of the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation. For Scotus, the Incarnation, God entering into human history in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, is God's greatest work and expresses God's fundamental reality and eternal desire. For Scotus, God's life is constantly revealed in the particularities of the created world, including each human life and human actions. Scotus offers a theologically and philosophically very positive view of what's specific and particular in the material world, even the smallest of things like a grain of sand. But this includes places and people. In his theology of God's incarnation entering into human history, Scotus taught that everything is rooted in God's purpose. Specific things, individual people, particular places are not dispensable. One place can't be substituted for another. The distinctive value of a particular person, any one of us, can't simply be replaced by another person. Everything has a unique value. Scotus suggests that in all things, particularly in their particularity, that all things participate directly in the life of God, who is, in the Christian tradition, the creator of everything. Therefore, each thing, each person, is a unique expression of God's beauty as a whole. So if we think of place, or a place, such as a particular city or a particular building, to the category of city or building is added an individualizing form. This makes a city or a building this city or this building rather than that building. Scotus gave the individualizing form the title thisness, or in Latin, haeccietas. So the first act of our human knowledge is to recognize, even if only vaguely, the specific. And only by observing the specific and the particular are we able to arrive, by a process of comparison, at the knowledge of the general. So, place, buildings, cities. So Scotus raised the particular from being just an example of a certain category. For him, what's particular, even a human structure such as a building, is actually more perfect precisely because it's unique. God's creation is predetermined to uniqueness and particularity. Scotus's idea of thisness, or haeccietas, can only be found in particular things. Now, this is, for me, highly relevant if we're going to take seriously the unique identity and value of each place and potentially every building. We should aim to make everything we build unique in some way, significant, life-enhancing, and beautiful in the deepest sense. And I'm going to return to the idea of beauty in a moment. Our sense of place has a strong impact both on how we see the world and on how we situate ourselves within it. However, in Western countries, particularly since the Second World War, towns and cities have too often undermined place identity in pursuit of values driven largely by economic considerations. The famous French social anthropologist Marc Auger, who was a student of Michel de Certeau, a Jesuit priest, a highly original Christian thinker, as well as a famous social scientist, Marc Auger distinguishes between place, which he says is engaged with our identity, embracing a variety of historical monuments and creative of social life, and what he calls non-place. In Auger's words, non-place means, I quote from him, curious places that are both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Here, for Auger, organic social life isn't possible. By non-place, Auger means contexts like supermarkets, airports, hotels, multi-lane highways, working at a computer, or sitting in front of a television screen. For Auger, these cause a certain fragmentation of our awareness and incoherence in our relationship to the world. Auger points to historic town centres as indicators of the importance of a sense of place. Such town centres, for example, squares or piazzas, contain buildings that have some kind of social authority, plus a symbolic meaning, whether these are religious, for example, a cathedral, civic, for example, the town hall, or historical, for example, a public monument. However, the key feature for objets of such town centres is that they are humanly active and hospitable to people. There, people can gather together and interact. Significant numbers of cafes, hotels, or businesses concentrate nearby, and cross-town routes pass through them. True centres, a true centre, offers a place for living by being a place of encounter, I quote from Auger, where individual itineraries can intersect and mingle, where a few words are exchanged, and are solitudes momentarily forgotten on the church steps, in front of the town hall, at the cafe counter, or in the baker's doorway. Now I want to turn to the idea of beauty. Many people think that the notion of beauty is just the opposite of ugly and simply means attractive, that it's a pleasure to look at, or tasteful in terms of shape, color, and being well proportioned. In this context, beauty has an objective side, its inherent properties, and a subjective side, the feelings evoked in us by something beautiful, for example, a building. In this sense, beauty does indeed lie in the eye of the beholder. However, there's much more to beauty than this. Historically, beauty is connected to aesthetics, which is a set of philosophical principles concerned with the nature of beauty and how we are to appreciate it. Now, the word aesthetics comes from the Greek aesthetikos, concerning perception, meaning how we come to understand reality through our senses. Philosophers over the centuries have written in various ways about beauty. For the Stoics in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, the Greek Chrysippus or the Roman Cicero, beauty is not just concerned with what's attractive, but is connected with the good or the sublime, that is, what's related to the sacred, what's related to our quest for ultimate meaning, and what's connected to our integrity. For example, for Chrysippus, the Greek philosopher, beauty referred to proper proportion and to the harmony between the parts and the whole. For the early Christian theologian, Augustine of Hippo, influenced by Stoicism as he was, aesthetics was closely related to what he calls harmonia, the fitting order of reality that reflects the beauty of God. Augustine connects beauty to virtue, particularly to what he calls the good. And this was further developed by the medieval Christian philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, where beauty embraces wholeness, integritas, harmony, consonantia, and radiance, claritas, all of them, according to Aquinas, expressive of God's reality. At the heart of the arts and of design, including architecture, is the power of the image. That is, the architect, the designer, or the architect creates a material expression of a deeper reality and communicates this via imagery. Observers, such as the rest of us, receive meaning through our imagination, evoked by the imagery. In other words, imagery, for example, the design of a building, has the capacity to touch the spiritual depths of our human perception beyond the limits of mere observation or description. In this context, what we mean by a good building and what it means to build well is not merely about efficiency or looking good, but should also be related to moral and spiritual values. And this brings me to the complicated and sometimes contentious question of what constitutes an iconic building. So what are iconic buildings? To be iconic surely means more than simply provoking amazement at design innovation or at the overwhelming size of a building that materially dominates my skyline. To my mind, being iconic also reflects motive and purpose. So a genuine question concerns whether the notion of iconic is more appropriate in relation to the design of an individual building or of a locality, for example, a city square or piazza, that reinforces the value of people and of a shared public life, rather than expresses social or economic domination. Thoughtful commentators, and hopefully also architects, suggest that apart from being impressively designed or highly visible, iconic structures should somehow act as collective symbols of true place. However, critical questions remain. To what extent do contemporary so-called iconic buildings, particularly if they are commercial buildings, express the value of place identity and the value of people? In contrast to the commercial nature of many contemporary iconic buildings, it's worth underlining that we misinterpret the historic role of religious buildings, such as city churches, if we link them only to explicitly religious activities. Throughout history, such buildings have also frequently been spaces for social connection and community definition. It's worth remembering that in the European Middle Ages, there was a significant permeability between religious spaces, such as a city church, and the surrounding streets. The sacred was not rigidly separated from the everyday. In the Middle Ages, churches were often the only significant public buildings and were therefore multi-purpose. There were markets held in the nave. Churches hosted community feasts. They provided meeting spaces for the craft guilds, and even in some places acted as hospitals. A good contemporary example of a religious building that crosses the boundary between the sacred and the everyday is the famous London Church of St. Martin in the Fields, which sits on one of the city's iconic public squares, Trafalgar Square. St. Martin's is closely involved in social justice issues at home and overseas. The building continues to offer multi-purpose spaces as a creative expression of the ancient tradition that I mentioned. Apart from regular religious worship, the church also hosts regular music concerts and art exhibitions. And as some of us know, between 2006 and 2008, there was a major renovation project involving the church and surrounding buildings. There's now a popular cafe in the crypt, and most strikingly, St. Martin's, with its surrounding buildings, offers an important centre for homeless people with multiple facilities. This mixture at St. Martin in the Fields is a contemporary example of the role that an accessible and non-exclusive sacred space may play in a major public square in a cosmopolitan world city. Now, I want to end my talk with a brief reflection on medieval Gothic cathedrals, such as Chartres, which we can now see. That's the main view down the nave. Many of these cathedrals survive today. Gothic architecture is an artistic form with powerful spiritual and theological resonances. The original theory was overtly spiritual. In these buildings, paradise was evoked and expressed in material terms through the design, the layout, and the artwork. To enter such a great church as Chartres Cathedral was to be transported into a transcendent realm by the space, the light, and the colour. The architecture of medieval cathedrals was a microcosm of the universe, was meant to be, and sought to express a peaceable oneness between God and material creation. Here, an idealized cosmic harmony was portrayed in the material structure. Medieval people entering these buildings were transported into a vision of heaven on earth by the juxtaposition of vast spaces such as the one we are looking at in Chartres, and intimate spaces, little side chapels, and by the progressive dematerialization of the walls with a sea of glass and a flood of light. During the 12th century, someone called Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis in Paris was one of the greatest early theorists of Gothic architecture. For Suger, a church building was a gateway to heaven and therefore needed in its structure to express a transcendent vision. At their best, the great medieval cathedrals portrayed another dimension of human life, a movement through space from earth to heaven. I just want to mention one example, and that's the medieval cathedral in Norwich. This has 250 roof bosses, which run down the center of the cathedral, vaulting from the choir back through the nave and ending at the west door. The bosses portray a history of salvation, beginning with the fall and ending with the final judgment and paradise. It's significant that the fall is nearest to the high altar and the final judgment and paradise are nearest to the exit through the west door. As a visual pilgrimage, it moves from the most sacred part of the cathedral, the high altar, to a door back onto the city streets. And it's not too far-fetched to suggest that this probably represents the viewpoint of the wealthy Norwich merchant class who funded much of the cathedral's decoration. The direction of the visual journey back to the main entrance suggests, and I'm sure this is what they wanted, that the city itself should be seen as sacred space. Interestingly, a famous feature of the great medieval Chartres Cathedral, which has captured the imagination of people who are not overtly religious, is the labyrinth, which you can now see. This is the labyrinth etched on the floor of the nave at the rear, and originally intended to be an image both of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for people who were unable to actually undertake that pilgrimage, and the pilgrimage of life towards our eternal destiny. Now, versions of this labyrinth design appear in other medieval cathedrals, either in a form like the one at Chartres, which enables you to walk through it in meditation, or, for example, at the city of Lucca in Italy, where it's a miniature on the wall outside the cathedral door. So somebody about to enter the cathedral in Lucca could, and indeed can still, because it's still there, trace the labyrinth design with a finger before entering the building. But the walking labyrinth of Chartres, which we're looking at, is nowadays reproduced around the world, not just in centers of spirituality, but also in public parks and in city squares, and I've seen several of these in the States. To walk the labyrinth cultivates attentiveness and stillness, and also symbolizes a quest for ultimate enlightenment. Now, because in a labyrinth, as opposed to a maze, there are no false avenues or dead ends, our walking through it always arrives at the center. Now, it's widely recognized that there was a diversity of aesthetics, concepts of beauty, and theological symbolism in the age of medieval Gothic architecture. This is emphasized in the illuminating study of medieval art and beauty by Umberto Eco, the famous Italian philosopher. Gothic cathedral space has been characterized, as we'll see in the next slide, as, among other things, dematerialized and spiritualized. In this way, the architecture expresses the limitlessness of an infinite God through the soaring verticality of the arches and of the roof vaults. These are a deliberate antithesis to human scale. We should also, and we can see this in this particular slide, also note the medieval fascination with the symbolism of numbers. So, for example, the conventional three-story elevation of Gothic church architecture, which we can see here, the main arcade, which is at the bottom, what's called the triforium, which is a kind of passageway in the middle, and the clerestory, i.e. the windows at the top, can't be explained simply by advances in medieval engineering. For example, Abbot Suger, already mentioned, drew explicit attention to its Trinitarian symbolism, that this three-level design is meant to point to the God as Trinity, three persons in one. However, what's interesting is that later Gothic church buildings, such as the famous King's College Chapel in Cambridge, are notable for another feature that was typical of their later period. The stone walls that support King's College Chapel were reduced to a minimum and replaced by vast expanses of glass. The biblical stories portrayed in the stained glass windows taught the worshipper a great deal about the Christian doctrine of God, the Christian understanding of creation, and the Christian understanding of what it means to talk about salvation. However, there was also a sense in which colored glass and its patterned effect on the stonework of the interior of the building expressed what's being called a metaphysics of light. God was proclaimed both as the one who dwelt in inaccessible light, yet whose divine light also lights up the world. A key feature of the theology of Abbot Suger and of medieval churches in general is that the material world is not incidental, but is necessary in order to draw humankind upwards to the heavenly realm. In the mind of someone like Abbot Suger, a church building should not only be adequate for public worship, but should also evoke wonder and point beyond itself to God's eternal dwelling place. In this way of seeing things, the church building is a doorway or an access point. Its beauty and harmony is represented not simply by its design, its architectural coherence, and its artwork, but by the degree to which it enables us to gain access to a spiritual realm. This is the true beauty, the harmonia of a religious building, such as a Gothic cathedral like Chartres. Now, in conclusion, I just want to underline that I don't see Gothic as the only architectural expression of a spiritual vision. In our own times, for example, minimalism has become a new design spirituality by portraying a Zen-like life characterized by pure light, space, and very few objects. The British architect John Pawson is a notable exponent of minimalism, not least in his striking design of the Cistercian monastery of Nowy Dwór in Bohemia. Minimalism relates beauty to an ethic of simplicity and also to ecological sensitivity in a world of excess. John Pawson offers a kind of material silence in response to the restlessness of our contemporary urban environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that elegant summary. And I think that I would turn to Peter Newby to open the questions, if I may.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I want to ask, you speak about particularity, Paisitas, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yes.
John Scotus, I suppose, having been trained in an own seminary with Thomas Aquinas and about the act of judgment, and that every particular, how do you understand it except through a universal? This is the thing that so that we share a common human nature, or though we're all individuals, as you say. I sort of see the role of the universal can't be just completely, as it were, abnegated. And thisness, therefore, I'm not quite sure how it connects with sort of, how do we connect different thisnesses?
Well, I think what Scotus was trying to do was to push back against the idea that it's only some kind of transcendent universal reality that is important. What he clearly wanted to emphasize was that in his understanding of God as creator, every material object, even the smallest grain of sand, was an equal reflection of God's own life. So it wasn't that he was denying the importance of some kind of universal meaning or universal truth, but rather he wanted to kind of recover a sense that we can't escape into this transcendent universal something when we're actually embodied persons living in a particular place, a particular time, a particular environment. So he was trying to say, look, all of this is in some sense an expression of the divine, of the spiritual, and we must take it seriously. We're not asked to escape the material to find God, but rather we're asked to embed ourselves more realistically in the material as an actual expression of God's creativity. So he was very much into embodiment and materiality as an expression of the spiritual and the divine.
Right. Does language, may I ask another question, as it were, fit halfway between the thisness and the universal? How do we communicate with others about the uniqueness of ourselves or the uniqueness of a place, which I completely agree with, and you can sense that when you go to a couple of little corners of London I love, which is just so unique that, but it's part of the city which I grew up in. But I have to use a language understandable to others in order to communicate that.
Yeah.
And using a language actually helps me to understand what I'm thinking myself. Because I know you can have a thought that you can't express in language, but somehow when you do, it sort of brings it to it creates an independence and therefore develops a richness which you wouldn't have when it remains an unformed thought in your mind. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree, and I think we've got to. I mean, for me, I think it's really important. And I was giving a lecture online last week to an American university on spirituality and public life. That they want, that was their choice. And the point about public life is that you know, theologians and also philosophers and other thinkers characterize public life as a space of communication, not of silent escape. I go back to the person I quoted, the French social scientist, social anthropologist, Marc Auger. I mean, he's very much into the idea that that's what's so important about city centers or town centers. They are places of encounter, of meeting, of communication, of actually talking with other people. And that a real world is only created through our sharing with others, through our communicating with others. And he talks about, you know, where our solitudes are somehow set aside, well, momentarily forgotten, he says, and where our individual journeys can intersect and mingle with other people's journeys. And he says, where a few words are exchanged and our solitudes are momentarily forgotten. And on the church steps, in front of the town hall, at the cafe counter, that's very, very French, or in the baker's doorway. But, you know, he's very much emphasizing that communication, conversation, engaging with others is really critical.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, I'm looking for other questions. Chris, thank you.
Hi, yeah, Philip, that was really a beautiful talk. And one of the things that we're often taught about in architects is the history of the big glass and letting light in, and light as a metaphor. But I have to say, I think there's also a missing aspect of darkness, which is critical to this as well. And I write quite a lot about medieval stuff, and particularly about the relationship between processions and architecture. And one of the most extraordinary moments, I'd have to say, was when I went to Salisbury for the Advent procession. And one of the things about it is, of course, that the whole aspect, it's because very rarely you're allowed in a Gothic cathedral without electric light completely reversing the iconography of light that within a cathedral. And in this occasion you are, and you start the whole thing off in darkness, the whole cathedral packed with darkness. And the windows, far from letting in light, are black, because of course you are looking out at blackness. And so if there is any light inside at all, the windows are completely reversed in the darkness. And then one voice and one candle begins to light more voices and more candles. And what I'm interested in is this experience aspect, because if one talks about place, the rituals that fulfill that type of place are a way in which the building, you have access to the iconography of the building.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that a part of the problem with contemporary interpretations of religious space is they're not given often enough of these varieties of experience which identify the space as both light and dark simultaneously. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, maybe two things. I mean, yes, I totally accept the business about we mustn't underestimate the importance of darkness. Trouble is, I think the word darkness is often, for some people, taken on a rather bleak, negative meaning. It's not a space where one can kind of be allowed to settle into a kind of, I don't know, meditative, undistracted, because I suppose the positive side of darkness is if we settle into it, there's no distraction. We don't see all sorts of things going on that mean we move our heads, or we look at this, we look at that, we look at that, and get distracted. So I suppose the positive side of darkness is it might enable us to become more centered, which is not a bad thing, humanly speaking. So no, I'm not underestimating darkness. I think the medievals certainly had a very strong emphasis on light, because that's one of the metaphors they had for the divine. And therefore, for them, light was important as an expression of God's presence in their lives. And, cathedral light, which of course would have been natural light, they would have had candles, of course, but they wouldn't have had electricity or anything like that. I think the other thing about medieval cathedrals is that, it's a building that expects you, in a sense, to walk around it, to make a pilgrimage around the actual space, rather than just settle in the middle. And that's why there's all these little side chapels, often which have beautiful pieces of statuary or iconography. So you can kind of do a pilgrimage all the way around, and eventually come back to the bigger space. So I'm certainly agree with you. There should be a balance between our emphasis on light and the potential of darkness in a positive sense, to enable us to become centered, rather than darkness as always seen as a sort of negative. No, I agree with you.
Thank you.
David, thank you. Do you want to come in? Thank you.
Yeah, mine is a simple question. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your theory of the image. I was very struck by the reference to Abbot Suger and the notion of gateway, and thought that maybe that comment, well, at least it led me to think that the earlier arguments about particularity might be understood as a particularity as a means of participation. That
Yeah,
the gateway is a type. Abbey Saint Denis is a particular.
yes.
And I wonder if you feel, as I concluded after your talk, that the image is a way of binding the particular to the general, or the instance to the type, or that, as you phrased it so nicely, this appearance of a deeper reality, that one really, it doesn't help us in architecture so much to dwell upon the particular unless it's seen as a means for participating in something general. And that's the task of the image.
Yes, I totally understand what you mean, and I agree very much so. And I think historically, and I can't speak as an architect because I'm not an architect, but I'm a religious historian, and I've been very interested in architecture and design for many years, and I've done work with architects, but you know, I speak as an amateur when it comes to that. Yes, I think particularity, image, whatever. I think the notion of that is that each of those things, if we take them seriously, provide a gateway to the more, the universal, the beyond. And I think that's why Scotus was so strong, saying, look, don't try and escape into this abstract otherness, this abstract universal. You've got to start with the particular, because that's your gateway, including your own body, the relationships you're involved with, the place you're in, a bit of natural landscape, the tree outside your window, whatever. These are all potential gateways to the transcendent, to the sublime, to the divine.
But you'd be unwilling to reverse it and say that transcendent is a gateway to the particular?
Yes.
In other words, without a concept, without a vision of the type gateway, Sujet doesn't know what he's talking about when describing the Saint-Denis. Well, in other words, the image, what I guess what I'm saying is that primacy isn't necessarily priority. And one
no.
You follow what
Something coming first in a sequence doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important thing. In fact, what it is presumably a gateway towards whoever you are, what you think of as the most important thing you're trying to reach out to. Therefore, the value of the particular, or the specific, however you like to do it, is that it provides a doorway into a more, an other, a transcendent, whatever it is that you're trying to reach out to.
Yeah, I guess in the absence of that transcendent, the comparison wouldn't be possible. In other words, you need that category or type to say that this is a church and not a barn, or vice versa.
Well, yes. I mean, I think I always try to be very careful these days, because we live in a culture and society in which a lot of people are not overtly religious anymore. And therefore, but a lot of people I know who would describe themselves as not religious, being, thinking of a member of my family who would say that he describes himself as an agnostic atheist, meaning I see myself as an atheist, but I don't want to be dogmatic about it. So I'll call myself an agnostic atheist, meaning atheism is what makes sense to me, but I know it not necessarily the total truth, because I don't know everything. For him, he has a very strong sense of the spiritual, that there is a more that goes beyond just the immediate, what I can see in front of my face, immediate satisfaction, immediate happiness, whatever. There is something more, but he doesn't want to describe it in religious terms. He doesn't want to say God or the sublime or whatever, but he certainly believes in something transcendent, which, as he says, he's agnostically atheistic about.
Thank you.
Well, with that ambiguity, I can see that Peter Carl has a question. Please, Peter.
Okay, let me light myself up.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was wonderful, and I particularly enjoyed the commitment to particularity. To use particular too many times. I wonder if we can't, the two comments, one just a comment and the other more of a question. Vis-a-vis universal and general, it's already an ambiguity in Aristotle's use of katalou, where sometimes he means what we would call universal, meaning all the attributes of virtue and meaning to which you attribute or which you call for in a proper embodiment of sacrality. But he also uses it, for example, for the class of all triangles, all isosceles triangles. And this ambiguity between the universal and the general is something that becomes more vivid, curiously, with the Romantics, who at the same time as they're committed to more concrete phenomena, dialogue between nature and the arts, and so on and so forth, do so at the level of the concept, which makes them generalities, which makes them refer extensively rather than intensively. And so for me, there's universal and particular and field and fragment as a kind of name for the world in which we're coping at the present. I don't know, I just leave that up in the air. But I think it also has to do with the notion of spiritual being dominated by the noetic, when I think what you're saying is that it's something that's got a deeply embodying aspect to it, with which I completely agree. One thing that was interested me in your notion of sacrality is you omitted sacrifice or the rite. And I just wondered what place that had in your notion of sacred place.
Could you just repeat that last thought so that I make sure I've understood what you were saying?
In your description of sacred place, there wasn't a lot of treatment of sacrifice or the rite or ritual. And to me,
right, get you.
That
Yes.
kind of time out of time, I think sacrifice is something added to time out of time celebration, right? That which can be recollected, therefore places history in dialogue with, origins. I think sacrifice is something added to that, but we don't have to worry about that. I'm just curious whether the ritual is, I mean, the tendency is to think of, even Gothic cathedrals as ritually constituted. They're in terms of what's repeated about them, what's numerically harmonic about them, what's all the effort that goes into them, the dialogue between theology and, stonemasonry and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, I didn't mention rituals. I mean, there was a limit. I felt there was a limit to what I could put in a talk that's meant to be only half an hour. Yes, I mean, one of the things about human existence in general, human life in general, not just in a religious building such as a cathedral, is that we are, as human beings, we rely a great deal on rituals. I was talking to my partner Susie about the way in which the grandchildren have their rituals that they somehow need in order to, they go through the same sorts of almost ritual practices when they come to visit. And it gives a sense of security. I mean, obviously religious ritual is very specific, but it is about repetition and sameness over and over and over again. It's a different moment, it's a different day, but the ritual remains the same. So there's something that's continuous, and there's something specific, because the ritual happened yesterday and it happens again today. Of course, religious buildings are persistently full of rituals. Religious services are, at least in many church traditions, is highly ritualistic. And it is worth asking ourselves why ritual is important for human beings, whether that's religious ritual or family rituals. We're going through certain processes, always doing the same thing in the same order. There's all sorts of ways, but I agree. I think ritual is an important part of human existence, and I think buildings in general, but religious buildings in particular, are kind of physical expressions of a sort of ritual way of trying to perceive reality and then move beyond the immediate to something that's transcendent.
Thank you. Do you want to respond, Peter, or do we? Can we turn to Matthew? Matthew Barac, please.
Hi. Yeah. Thanks very much. I was going to turn to the part of your talk where you started you turned to this question of iconic buildings. And you moved from the theme of image to iconic buildings, and you talked about how structures should, how iconic structures should in some way act as collective places. And I was just interested, especially with regard to this sort of outline question of how or what architects or architecture do now in terms of the kinds of places we make, and how we could do it better. This argument about iconic buildings also in relation to what makes such spaces or buildings beautiful, and how they function with regard to ideas about the beautification of the city and what that might be for. And I was also thinking historically, as it happens, I'm covering some lectures for Nick Temple, who's also here because he's on research leave, and I was talking today to some students about the function of some of the important spaces and buildings, especially with regard to the cathedral in Florence. The function of
which I know very well.
The function in terms of these ideas about beautification of obviously negotiating between a whole lot of priorities, including the role of the patrons, but also to do with making sense, if you like, the function of making sense, not so much as explaining, but making connections between, as you say, the universal and particular elements, also between the individual lives of people and the idea of the kind of corporate example. But in this idea of making sense, there's also the craft aspect, literally the making that the artist does through seeing and then turning it into paint or an image, and the making that the architect does in terms of the collective work of trying to make settings for people to experience this togetherness. And then in relation to all of that, with the examples you showed towards the end and talked about, I was wondering about the very different atmospheres that we find in some of these sacred buildings, from the kind of almost mysterious or ethereal quality of this dematerializing light, as you called it, whether in the high Gothic or later with the perpendicular examples, and then some of the Renaissance examples, much more, if you like, pedagogical, you could say, and quite grand in many cases. And then with the Baroque, the sort of glorious and sort of flourishes with still very kind of connecting these symbolic ideas to quite human interaction with each other and the activities in the church. And then, of course, with some of the latter day examples, like the John Pawson or Tadao Ando springs to mind, or some of those examples of Stephen Hall, for example, often very, as you say, silent spaces, and spaces which feel much more like places not so much of clutter or of activity and communication, but rather of withdrawal. And whether that says something about the kind of ideas about spaces that should be beautiful for us in a city, maybe there's a different kind of, I suppose that thread maybe tells us something about the different functioning of those kinds of spaces with regard to this idea of how an icon should anchor spaces in the city.
Yeah,
a little wayward at the end, but there we go.
Well, I think probably what I was trying to emphasize in just a few things I said about iconic buildings is that for a lot of people, or the way some people talk about iconic buildings, it's really in terms of simply they're so big they dominate my horizon, and I'm trying to say, well, I'm not sure that makes them the domination or being dominant, just because the only thing you can see is this great big massive commercial building. Being iconic, it seems to me, is a much more complex and richer term. For me, an icon, well, think back to the kind of the tradition of icons, in the Eastern, they are attempts to express the sublime and the transcendent through a particular image. But what's very interesting is that for the Orthodox Christians, by observing an icon, they believe that if you, as it were, focus upon it wholeheartedly, that you may be led through the icon to that which the icon seeks to represent, i.e. God or a saint or whatever it is. So literally, the icon becomes a medium, a doorway into something much greater. And it seems to me, if we think about buildings, what kind of values are being expressed in buildings that we think of as iconic? Are they human values? Are they about the value of people? Or are they about the value of money, for example? I mean, I'm just throwing that out as a kind of question. For me, I think a true icon is one that, even if it is a commercial building in a city like the City of London, that it nonetheless points to something that has to do with values, spiritual values, ethical values, whatever you like, and particularly the value of human people. Because in the end, that's the center of our experience. We build buildings, ultimately, it seems to me, for people, even if it's commercially, it's not just domestically, but commercially, religiously, there's all sorts of ways. But the point about, for me, the essence of a building is that it's person-centered, or should look as if it is in some way person-centered.
Thank you. On that, I think that was also a very, very useful session of questions and answers. Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much for laying out those territories so clearly and with such a broad philosophical ground. So I would just like to applaud your seminar very much with everyone, and wish you well.
Well, and thank you everyone for your patience in listening to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much.